Hello, everybody. It is May 23rd, 2026, here in the United States of America. I hope everyone out there is having a fantastic day. In this video, I would like to talk about how human beings, generally speaking, don't really care what kind of system they live under, be it a monarchy, a republic, a democracy, or some other form of government, so long as their basic needs are provided for. Human beings, at the end of the day, want security, stability, any reasonable standard of living, and a fairly tolerable level of freedom, but not necessarily complete and total moral chaos. I would say the system itself doesn't really matter. It's what the system can provide for. Now, this video is not meant to be some kind of takedown of democracy or pro monarchy or like pro fascism or pro communism or something like that. This is an observation I've had of human history and a conclusion that I myself have come to. I think this is just an honest observation about human history. Most people aren't ideologues or revolutionaries. They don't really care about these grandiose ideas of building a perfect society, not because they're too stupid to understand these concepts by any means, but because they prefer to scale things from what is most immediately important to them to what is least impactful. Food prices, energy prices, and the ability to raise a family and to buy a home, how high their taxes are, whether they have access to housing. Those needs come first over what type of government is actually providing this at the end of the day. If the current system is seen as unable to provide for the basic common good, then people will turn to the system that can. Democracy is only really loved when it provides actual benefits. It's not loved just because it's democracy. Democracy is supposed to provide prosperity and freedom, but when it doesn't provide for that, people will turn to a system of government that they feel can, satisfy their personal needs. If all democracy seems to present is one electoral crisis after another and constant social chaos and uncertainty, then people will seek stability elsewhere. Democratic governments are, I would say, not the end of history. They've always existed in some form and generally only under the right conditions. They don't seem to flourish well in chaos when there's famine, rampant poverty, social unrest, war, disease, and whatnot. Very catastrophic things for a society to undergo. That's when democracies don't really do so well and people turn to somebody who can coalesce decisions together at the top of the hierarchy and deal with problems immediately. I think that's a cycle we've seen through human history. It's what happened with the Roman Republic, I would say. Decades and decades of civil war and chaos culminated in Caesar's attempt to take complete control of the Roman Republic and reshape it in his own image. And then his adopted nephew, Augustus, I would say, succeeded in what Caesar intended and turned the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. But we'll go over that later in this video. As I mentioned, democratic governments, lost my train of thought there for a second. Democratic governments are not necessarily the end of history. We assume that this era in time that we inhabit is the peak of human history. As we've reached our destiny. The world will slowly become more and more democratic. Despotisms and monarchies will be a thing of the past because they're outdated, and we are a much more enlightened people. I think that is a very foolish assumption to make. As I've mentioned before, democracies have existed, democratic governments have existed throughout human history and have been continuously usurped and replaced by more authoritarian governments that can more readily address issues regarding stability and war and whatnot. So the assumption that this cycle will be any different, I think, is just foolish and arrogant and made by people who don't really understand the human condition and human history. Now, Americans, such as myself, have benefited for quite some time living under a constitutional republic. Ever since the founding of this country has had generally one form of government, which it's been the constitutional republic. Now, there's been some changes to it. Senators are now popularly elected. The Constitution has been amended a few times to adjust for changing social conditions, but our government generally does remain unchanged and has been a fairly stable government. We've had one major civil conflict, and other than that, this country has been relatively stable. I would say up until rather recently. We do have a constitution that does guarantee some basic civil rights, and for a while we've had an appropriate level of freedom, but with some reasonable social restraints. But what I think a lot of people feel has happened is those social restraints have been removed, and now the United States has generally become a moral free-for-all, where some people have a moral standard that they cannot compromise on, and every election to them is an existential crisis, because the possibility of losing that election brings about the real possibility that their entire moral worldview will be unable to function in the country that follows the election. And the children will be exposed to things that they wish the children did not see. This is just a reality of American society. But in this day and age, there seems to be no real consensus on what kind of democracy the United States should have at this point. Some people want to make it a direct democracy where they get rid of the Electoral College, which would cause a whole host of problems between the states. They would make some states basically irrelevant politically, and I would say instead of the country being 50 semi-independent countries acting together in a federation, it would just become a country with provinces. And every election at this point feels like an existential crisis and the edge of a calamity, as I just mentioned before. The visions for what the country ought to be in the future and what humanity ought to be in the future vary wildly between both American political parties. One American political party seems to think that mass uncontrolled immigration does not affect stability in any way, shape, or form and will propel the country into the future and make it a tolerable paradise. While the other half, I would say, takes a much more realistic and pragmatic approach to how a country functions, although I say both sides are still mired in this dialectic between modern 19th and 20th century systems of economics that I'd say both on their own don't really address certain challenges that a civilization's leadership needs to address to continue that civilization, any kind of capacity. There's rampant corruption in this country. It's obvious, and yet no real meaningful measures are taken to restore public trust. I think people are pretty aware of what I'm talking about. I don't need to mention it by name. Energy costs, food prices, medical expenses are rising really with no end in sight. I can attest to that. My energy bills have doubled and tripled over the past year. Jobs generally don't pay what they did in the past, and in comparison with the costs of what I just mentioned before. These costs go up, wages don't really go up in relation to them, and people have a lot less purchasing power. It's putting a lot of people under a great deal of stress and anxiety. And promises aren't really kept by either party, and each election cycle leaves disaffected and frustrated voters, even for, let's say, the winning party. This is causing a great bit of frustration and tension within our society. Differences between religious differences, views on morality, prices going through the roof. I would say the point I'm making here is, as conditions get worse in this country, people will lose faith with the system that we've always had if it can no longer provide for the common good and keep a large enough segment of our population happy to keep the country stable. Now, it doesn't have to be the entire country that becomes frustrated and starts engaging in civil unrest. It can be a large enough of a percentage, but it doesn't have to be the entire country by any means, because there's always people that are going to benefit from the system, and then always other people that are completely what's the word for it? They don't really care either way. They don't care about much of anything. They're just trying to exist, and they don't have the energy to, I would say, engage in any kind of civil unrest. Excuse me 1 second here. I don't want to pause the video, but I do have to answer this text message. This is my sister. She has to drop something off. I had to tell her that I'm currently making a YouTube video and leave it on the front porch, and I'll get it after. Anyways, let's continue on. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Rome was once a republic, but a man named Augustus changed that. He put himself in charge and kept the facade of Rome still being a republic to make what he was doing more culturally palatable. Rome had been mired in decades of civil war and instability. I'm sure the average Roman was becoming very frustrated with constantly being conscripted to fight on the side of some random Roman general or politician. They would like to, sow their crops and get on with their life rather than just constantly be, mired in warfare. But Augustus came in and stabilized the Roman Republic, but it never went back to being a republic. Roman civilization carried on for quite some time after, but no longer reverted to what it once was because that system was seen as chaotic and unstable. Rome abandoned it didn't completely. Roman civilization fundamentally changed, and it wasn't, again, like a republic in the style that it used to be. Although Rome kept much of those institutions for quite some time, they were neutered and most power laid with the first citizen, the emperor. Now, if America continues on its current trajectories, that in our future, I would say if the American government cannot provide for the common good and is perceived as unable to provide for the basic needs of its citizens, well, that may well change. If each election cycle leads to disappointment and continued chaos, then I would say at some point something has to give. I would say that a member of this country's elite or ruling class, a real man of history, will attempt at least to do something similar to what Augustus did. But I will say this, very few men that have existed in history have the political skill, luck, and intelligence that Augustus did. This is something very hard to pull off. But I would say currently people are comfortable enough to tolerate the system, but the country is trending in a direction where within a few decades or even sooner, this may no longer be the case. Now, I'm not advocating here for revolutionary change. I'm not advocating for any specific kind of outcome. I'm not saying that this country should become a monarchy or a dictatorship, or completely throw off the idea of democracy, or being a republic and overhaul it in its entirety. I'm not advocating for that. But what I am talking about here is something that is inevitable and unavoidable when certain circumstances present themselves. If you look at human history, when you look at certain social trends or certain trends happening in any civilization, the same result tends to happen. Destabilization results in an abandonment of the previous system, and usually another system comes up to replace it, and that system usually becomes a bit more authoritarian to deal with the immediate problems that a kind of messy and democratic government couldn't address. Now, that doesn't always have a good or positive outcome for that country, but it does tend to happen in inevitable cycles. Now, it's not just the United States that I think is starting to, drift towards this kind of outcome. It's much of the West in general. There's a lot of frustration across the United States, especially now that I would say the current administration isn't really living up to its promises by any means. And they know that any kind of administration from the other party certainly wouldn't live up to those promises either. Across the EU, similar feelings exist in EU member states. I think the EU is trying to function as a cohesive European entity, like a European empire, but doesn't really understand how to do that because it's being led by people that don't understand how to do that. And so this idea of democracy being holy and sacrosanct and something that cannot be questioned, I think that's a cultural sentiment that's starting to fade in many places as these governments don't really provide for basic security and the common good anymore, according to quite a large percentage of these countries' populations. As I mentioned, I think this is an inevitability. I think history goes in cycles. If you really study it closely, I think certain outcomes are inevitable given the human condition and how we respond to things. But we'll see what happens. I'm just saying that this is all a possibility as these things become more magnified and get worse, and people start to really place those several most important things that I mentioned at the beginning of the video first and foremost in their lives, and they care less and less about systems and politics and revolutions and ideologies, and they just end up wanting results. But anyways, if everyone out there, if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. Drop me a like. I will be back tomorrow with another video to make up for the last 2 weeks where I haven't really produced any content. Yeah, tune in next time, and I'll see everybody then. Have a good one.